These are country loaves, and I start with two kinds of starter, whole wheat starter and a white flour starter. And so I'm going to go ahead and feed those right now. Let me get them out of the refrigerator. So I keep mine in jars like this. These are pint jars, I think, and I like the wide mouth ones. So this is my whole wheat starter and my white flour starter. This is how they look after definitely a little over a week. I've left these. You can see there's still some bubbles down in that whole wheat one. I think this one has a few bubbles in it still. So I'm going to go ahead and feed these right now. Okay, so I'm letting the water warm up, and I've got my two starters here. I got my whole wheat flour in this jar and my white flour right here in this jar, and I've got a 1/4 cup measuring scooper there. I like to let this water warm up because I like to use warm water when I get the starter activated. So go ahead and do this. That's what the starter looks like inside there. And I use a regular old bread flour. So it's a good quality bread flour from a Mennonite store locally here in Sandpoint. So I'm going to just go ahead and scoop 1/4 cup in there. I have a butter knife, and so I just kind of add a little water and stir it up, and it's about the consistency of soft peanut butter right there. So I use warm water. It's been in the fridge for a while, this starter has, so as I splash a little warm water in there, it kind of warms it up, wakes up that starter a little bit. So I'm going to do the same thing with the whole wheat flour. Put a 1/4 cup or so in there. Do a little bit of some warm water. Get that stirred in. That one's a little runnier than normal, but I don't mind it a little runnier when I'm going to use it for some bread. I like to store it in the refrigerator a little drier. Okay, so now I'm just going to go ahead and put the lids back on these starters. I don't screw them on totally tight. And in the summertime, I just leave them right here on the counter. So once these two starters have about doubled in size, sometimes they start to kind of overflow in the jars. That's when I use them. All right, we're back. So it has been approximately 4 or 5 hours. I think it's actually been closer to 5 hours since I fed these two starters, and they have now approximately doubled in size, as you can see here. This is the white flour, and it's basically filled the jar up. There's the wheat flour one here, and it doesn't. The wheat flour one never rises quite as rapidly, but as you can see, and it's still kind of that peanut butter-like consistency, which is usually what I'm going for. So I will get the dough going now, which is about a 75% hydration dough. I mix that up, and then about a half hour later, I add these two starters into it. Okay, now I'm gonna go ahead and mix up this dough, and the way I do it, I use this large green mixing bowl, and apparently this bowl has been in the family for a really long time. There's a picture of me with that bowl on my head. This is the green mixing bowl. It has a lid for it, and that works really nicely, so when the dough is resting, it can be covered. I've got my scale. I'm gonna turn it on. I've just started using fluid ounces to do these mixes, so that's the way I've been doing it. Anyways, I'm gonna make a large batch of dough, so I'm gonna use 40 ounces of flour. And I tend to use about 5 to 10% wheat flour and 90 to 95% of the bread flour. So got some flour over here. I'm going to stick this bowl on my scale, and it says 11.2 ounces. I'm going to zero that out. So now I've subtracted the bowl from the tier there, and that's 19.8. This dough that I'm making will end up making 4 loaves of bread. So I've got it at a 35 ounces. I'm going to put a little bit more in. 37. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the rest. I'm making 40 ounces of flour. So as a 75% hydration dough, that will equal about 30 to 33 ounces of water. So next I'm gonna come over here, and for this particular dough, it's gonna take one of these jars full. I've measured this dozens and dozens of times, maybe even hundreds of times. So I go with one of these jars. It's about 33 ounces of water. And then I'm going to mix that up, and that's going to make a fairly shaggy dough. So I just start dumping that in there, and I kind of swirl the dough around. I pretty much just use the whole water. Some people like to save a little bit of the water aside from the water to help mix in the starter later, and I don't find that that does much. Got my trusty wooden spoon here. So I just go ahead and give this a thorough mix, and it, like I said, it doesn't end up being a very smooth dough right away. It is a fairly shaggy dough, they call it. So it's got some dry flour around it. And the water that I used was lukewarm water in the tap, again, like I used to feed the starter. I feel like that kind of jump starts the whole dough process. I also like to use my scraper to kind of get some of the dough off the spoon afterwards. Then I'm going to just let this sit. There's the dough right there. It's kind of shaggy. That's just flour and water. I'm going to just let that sit for 30 minutes. All right, so we're back. It's been about 30 minutes, and the dough is looking like this. It's still a shaggy dough, but it is the water has fully saturated the flour nicely. And so what I do next is I like to wet my hands a little bit. I take my starters here that have risen double, and I just basically scoop most of it out of this jar, and I leave, you know, maybe about a quarter of a cup down at the bottom. I always start with the white flour because I don't mind if the white flour contaminates the whole wheat flour a little bit, but I don't like the whole wheat flour to contaminate the white flour. It ends up leaving some brown stuff in there. Anyway, I just leave a little bit at the bottom so that I can feed those, and I go ahead and start doing this thorough mixing of the starter in there. And don't really need that spoon in there, but there's really only one way to do this that I've found, is to just really get your fingers in there and hands in there and just really scrape the dough off the bottom. So I don't really need this. But I kind of scoop the dough out off the side, stretch it up, and push it down in the middle. And then really, basically what you're trying to do here is thoroughly mix the starter into this shaggy dough that you've made. And the way that I was describing the measurements earlier, this is a fairly large dough that I'm making. It'll fill this green bowl up completely. It's, like I said, 40 ounces of flour plus 30 ounces of water, which is a 75% hydration dough. But if you were going to make just one loaf, I used to do 17 ounces of flour with about 12.5 ounces of water, or 12.75 ounces, I think, of water. And that would get you one nice big country loaf. I make bread for some family members, so I like to do it 4 at a time. So that's my method for getting the starter mixed in here. Now I'm going to go ahead and let this set for another 30 minutes, and I find this to be the best way of cleaning my fingers off. Alright, a little quick wash of my hands, and I'm going to just leave this dough covered for another 30 minutes. Now that I have the starters mixed in, I'm going to grab the honey and the salt. Normally what I do, this is my honey here I get from a local place, and then I just keep this thing full of my fairly coarse salt. It's sea salt, I think, of some kind. And I leave those on the counter once I'm in this position. The next thing I have to do is feed my starters again. So I'm going to go ahead and mix another quarter cup of whole wheat flour in there. Mix another quarter cup of white flour in there. And I'm going to just add water again. And then what I like to do with my starter, now that I've fed it a second time, this is the feeding so that it can be stored in the refrigerator for the next week or so. I like to let this start rising a little bit. I'll let it rise about maybe halfway. So now that I've used most of the starter in there and I fed it in a quarter cup. So now it's only about maybe a quarter to a third full. So total rising, this would come up to, maybe there, as it doubles. But I'm going to let it rise up to maybe there, and then I'll put it back in the refrigerator. So I'm going to leave it on the counter for 2 or 3 hours tonight, and let it rise, let some bubbles get started forming inside there, let the fermentation process start in there, and then I'll be able to set these back in the refrigerator for a week. Okay, we're back. It's been 20 minutes or half an hour later, and it's time to mix in the salt and the honey to this dough. The way I do it is pretty much just wing it on the amount of honey. I like my bread to be quite sweet, so I put in several big dollops of the honey from this thing. My honey's getting kind of low in this jar, so I'll have to do this probably 3 or 4 times to get the amount that I like. I'm guessing for this thing I'm putting close to a quarter cup in here. So for your single loaf, maybe a couple tablespoons would do. And I also wing it on the amount of salt. Seems like an awful lot of salt, but 4 loaves of bread. So now I'm just going to wet my hands a little bit and really thoroughly mix that salt and honey into this dough. And you really have to kind of crush it in there with your fingers, just really break up the dough, because now it's starting to, now that the water's been mixed in and the starter has been mixed into this 40 ounces of flour, the gluten is starting to form, and the dough, the loaf is, the dough is forming a lot of bonds and grains, I would call it, inside there. So you really have to kind of break all that up in order to thoroughly integrate the salt and the honey in there. But I've made some dough, I've made some bread with not very much salt and honey in it, and I much prefer a heavy blend of salt and sweet in my sourdough loaves. I think there's probably a point of diminishing returns where, I think the problem you can get with adding too much honey is that you'll get kind of a sticky crust. This is the way that I prefer to do the mixing, is basically roll the bowl around, grab an edge, and then just fold it up towards the middle. And now that I've gotten the honey integrated pretty well, it starts to sort of form a single dough again. I broke it up pretty good to get the honey mixed in there. And now I'm just basically turning and folding. It's a little after 10 o'clock at night right now. I'll probably go to bed at midnight, so I might mix this again 2 more times before I actually go to bed. And then it'll basically just sit in the bowl with the lid on it all night long, and it'll probably raise up not quite double in size. And tomorrow I will show you how I cut this into 4 boules and put put it in the proofing baskets and get it ready for baking. All right, we're back again, and it's been about an hour and a half. It's 11:40 now. It was about 10:15 when I left you last, and our dough has absorbed the salt and the honey very well. So it's time to give this a little mix, a little bit of a knead. I'll try to get this camera to adjust the lighting. My two starters have been sitting there for an hour and a half. There's now some air or some gases starting to form in there. This one maybe a little less, but there's definitely some in there. So they've raised a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and stash these back in the refrigerator now. So they will be ready in 1 week or so for my next loaf. Then I make bread about once a week. The mixing for me goes like this. Normally I wet the spoon a little bit to keep it from sticking too much. Sort of start separating it from the edges. And this process here is supposed to just sort of start stretching the dough out, get the glutens to sort of form. I basically just lift the edge, stretch it out a little bit, and flip it back into the middle. Flipped a little chunk out of the bowl there. So now it'll sort of absorb all those folds. It's shaped into a nice little roll there now. Normally I just leave the spoon in there because I'm going to try to mix it one more time before I go to bed for the night and let it do its bulk fermentation. All right, and lastly, one more quick little stretch and fold here before I head off to bed. Let this dough do its bulk fermentation. Sometimes get some of that dough off the wooden spoon. You can just kind of slap it on there. But there we go. That's pretty much about it. Get up tomorrow, bowl it up into some proofing baskets, and then I'll let it proof for the rest of the morning and into the early afternoon, and I'll bake it tomorrow sometime. Alrighty, it's the next morning, about 9 o'clock. It's been several hours with this dough, so let's take a look at it. And it has nicely risen about, I'd say, 40 to 50%, maybe even 60%. Probably raised about half as much as it will totally raise. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to dump a bunch of this flour out on the counter. Use my scraper and just loosen this dough up from the bowl. Let it just kind of pour right out onto the counter like that. And then I like to take this thing and kind of just like fold it in on itself, sticky side in. And I roll it into a kind of a roll. And now I'm going to divide it into 4 pieces. And I've got another product here that is kind of optional. This is called semolina, and it's sort of a grainy, almost cornmeal-like wheat product. Semolina. You can use that, or you can just use flour in your proofing baskets. So I've got these proofing baskets. I just ordered them from Amazon, and that's what I use. You could probably also use an oiled pan of some kind. So I'm just going to go ahead and divide these up into 4 loaves. use a little bit of the flour to get them going. That's kind of a big one there, so that's good. I don't really try very hard to make these the exact same size or anything. I just get them close. It's okay if I have 4 differently sized loaves. A little flour on top of them, get that going. Basically this part here is to shape them, and when you're kind of getting a little surface tension on them as you spin them around here, so they stay in a nice bread loaf shape. At this point, a lot of times I'll save one of these, this large bowl here off to the side, and instead of putting it in the proofing basket, I'll just put it back in that green bowl, the mixing bowl, and put the lid back on it and let it do a little bit more rising, and I'll use that as a pizza crust later. And who doesn't love pizza, right? This one ended up kind of small, but that's perfectly fine. Nice having different sized loaves. So there we go. I got 4 completely different sized loaves here. This really big one, the next size, and then a little bit smaller, and then a small loaf. So I think what I'll do is just go ahead and toss these in these proofing baskets. So I put a little semolina in each one, in each basket, and this one didn't really totally absorb in on itself, so I'll just kind of help it a little bit. And then what I do is get some plastic bags, and I just put that in a plastic bag like that, put a plastic bag around it, and then I'll just set that off to the side to do a secondary proofing. This one already has a whole bunch of semolina in it. So it just sits right there. The basket is got a lot of these little ridges in it, so that holds some of that semolina or flour. When I didn't have semolina, I just used flour in here, and that works perfectly fine too. And that's just to keep the stickiness of the dough from sticking to the proofing basket. And then when you flip it into the Dutch oven to bake, it drops right out of here easily. So there you have it. I'm going to now let these four loaves rise for another few hours, 4 or 5 hours, maybe this afternoon. It's 9 now, probably 1 or 2 o'clock this afternoon. I'll turn the oven on and get them baking. So I'll see you guys then. All right, so we're back, and these doughs have been sitting here on the counter for a good portion of the day. It's now basically 3 o'clock. I started the doughs at about 10 o'clock last night, and at 3 o'clock today they're ready to bake. So I don't know, what is that, 15, 18 hours total time overnight, plus a good half of the day. I'll show you what they look like here. Here's one of the doughs, and I just keep it in the proofing basket with some plastic on it, and you can see it's risen. This is the smallest one. It's risen a little bit, and it's got some bubbles over here. There's a poke test you can do. I'm not sure how accurate it is, but if you poke the dough it starts coming back, but it still stays poked in a little bit. So you kind of poke it and it starts kind of refilling itself, or the dent comes out, but it stays there a little bit. That's when you know you've gotten a pretty good fermentation on the dough. You've gotten a pretty good rise out of this second proofing, they call it. So what I do next is I come over here to the oven and bake 500 degrees, and I'm gonna get my two Dutch ovens, because I've got 4 loaves going this time. So I got a campfire style Dutch oven, and it's full of a bunch of semolina from last time, or flour, whichever one you're using. And I just dump that out. You can probably use the same stuff anyway. I just leave some of that in there to keep it from sticking to the bottom. But I'll put that in just before, I'll put some fresh stuff in just before I put those doughs in there. So the way I do it is I put my Dutch ovens in the middle there, kind of on the high side, and then I put each lid underneath it. And that way, when it's preheated, I can pull the Dutch oven out, plop the dough in there from the proofing basket, and put the lid on it. Okay, now the oven was able to preheat to 500 degrees, and I'm ready to put the first 2 loaves in the Dutch ovens. So I'll show you how that goes. First, I take the Dutch oven out, and I put a little semolina. When when stuff is this hot, 500 degrees, can't help getting a little bit of smoke from the oven. So when you first put that semolina in there, it steams and smokes a little bit. So I'm going to grab this first loaf, which is fairly small, and I'm just going to tip it right in there. I'm going to put it in the smaller crock. I sort of flop it in there and let it roll in, and then I lightly brush off the semolina from underneath it, because it seems to bake a little better that way. Oh, this is a big one. This must have been that really big one. So as you can see, it rose really nicely. So I'll drop this one into the larger Dutch oven. You sort of have to just let it roll right in there. Brush off some of that semolina so it bakes evenly. And then back into the oven they go for 20 minutes. With the lids on. So 20 minutes with the lids on. Timer, 20 timer. And that's going to be 20 minutes with the lids on. And then I do another 8 minutes with the lid off. Okay, as you can hear, the sound of the timer is going off, which means that the oven is ready, the bread is ready to take the lids off and get the last 8 minutes going. So I just open up the oven, take the lids off, and I'll show you guys what it looks like right now. So as you can see, that one on the left's a little darker than the one on the right, but it's they're pretty close. So I'll go ahead and set that timer for another 8 minutes, and we will see that one comes out. All right, 20 seconds left, so I think I'm safe to take these 2 loaves out, and I'm pretty sure they're going to look really good. Nice and dark crust, which is what we like. I've got this small little rack that I set them on, so here goes. That's the first one. That's what it looks like coming out of the Dutch oven. Here's the second one, the smaller one. Got a little bit darker. I think the smaller they are, the quicker they cook. So I will scoop it out of there using a bread knife. Seems to pop right out of there with that semolina. It keeps it from sticking to the Dutch oven. The tricky part about baking bread is that the dough is sticky and you have to keep it floured in order to handle it. So I'm going to go ahead and bake my other 2 loaves. But there you have it. That's Country Loaves by Anthony J. Powell. Got these 2. It looks like they've risen just a little bit more, each of them. So I got a medium size and a large size loaf again. So I'm going to put that large one in the larger Dutch oven. Brush off some of that semolina just to allow the heat to get at the crust. I probably overdo it on the lubricating flour, the semolina, or if in your case maybe you'll be using flour. But I prefer not to have it stick to stuff. So in they go with the lids on for 20 minutes. And one of the things I really like about the sourdough is it's fairly forgiving. Like I could have baked them 2 hours ago, or I could bake them 2 hours from now, and they probably would turn out about the same, which is nice. Next, what I do is I bought this special brush. I got it at the chef store, and I use it only for this one job of brushing off these loaves. So I just brush some of that semolina off the outside, just to keep that stuff from getting all over the place. But there you have it. That's yeah, that's a real good one. I tend to kind of like it like this. It's got a real hard crust on it right now, but when I put it in a plastic bag and maybe leave it overnight, the crust softens up a little bit, but it's definitely dense and hard and very chewy. So this is the other loaf. Just gonna brush that off there. Everyone on Facebook always remarks about the cool swirly look of the texture on the outside of the top of the loaf. And that comes from the proofing basket. But you don't need a proofing basket in order to have a successful loaf. You see that cool little spiral there, the imprint of the proofing basket. I've had pretty good success using just an oiled bowl to let it do its final rise in. You know, it's a little different texture on the outside if you do that, or you could make a loaf in a bread pan, like a rectangular bread pan for maybe sandwich type slices. But my preference is the country loaf, which is this real dense crust and stuff. So you can't beat this stuff just right out of the oven after it's cooled. You don't want to cut into it right now. The crumb will be really soft and squishy, and it'll kind of, you know, be doughy a little bit. But if you let it cool, I mean, it's still cooking in my hand right here because it's so hot. Let this cool off for a good hour and then cut into it, and a little bit of butter, and it's delicious. So I'll let you guys see the other 2 loaves after they come out and give you a little conclusion. 8 more minutes with the lid off. All right, that sound again means our final 2 loaves are done. And here to join in with our little taste test is the lovely Michelle. Hot stuff coming out of the oven. I'll go ahead and brush these off, and then we are going to taste the other 2 loaves, one of the other 2 loaves. All right, there's that one, steaming right out of the oven. Put that over here. Get this final loaf. Brush it off. Michelle, you can go ahead and pick out one of those 2 loaves. the other two, one of these two here,
Okay.
so people can see what that lovely crumb and crust looks like.
Okay. Oh.
All right, there's another little slice for you. Little butter. What do you think?
That's the good stuff.
That's the good stuff. So there you have it. Sourdough bread. It's not difficult. It's pretty easy.
That was very good too.
Tastes great. Mmm. All right. Get yourself in the kitchen and start baking.